Welcome everybody, good afternoon. My name is Fiona Stubbs. I'm the Careers Manager for the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences here at the University of Glasgow. Thank you for joining us. I will introduce the panel in a short while, but just in classic style, I just need to go through a few housekeeping things. You have joined a webinar, so your cameras and microphones are turned off. If you could make sure, keep them turned off, that would be great. But please ask lots and lots of questions of our panelists. But can you use the Q&A function? And if you wiggle your mouse, you'll be able to see the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat function. So please use the Q&A function and not the chat function. This webinar will be recorded. In fact, it's being recorded now. And you'll be able to find a copy of this, or we will be able to use it again in our YouTube channel for the Careers Service. We have a tight schedule today. We're finishing at 4:45. So both Maxine and I are going to share asking Katrina and Nick the questions, and that will then give you time to ask your questions. So please dig deep and think of some questions. It's your opportunity to ask the experts the questions. Can I just say that this is the end of our first day in the Careers Science Fair. We've had 7 panelists today, and tomorrow we're having a Careers Fair in the Wolfson Medical Building Atrium, where you can meet some great science companies. So please come along to that. It's between 11 and 2. So I will kick off. So can I just ask the question, can you remind us of your job title, where you work, and the sort of few things you might typically do in your role? Can I start with you, Katrina?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a senior educational psychologist in Renfrewshire Council. So as educational psychologists in Scotland, we typically work for local authorities and local councils. It's quite rare that we would work privately here compared to other areas across the UK, perhaps. So our role is typically split into kind of 2 different types of work. So we provide a service to our schools, nurseries, families, communities, children and young people through our kind of more direct casework and involvement on that level. And in Renfrewshire, we quite often work to support the establishment, to support the child, recognising that we're not there day in, day out as the teachers and their key adults are and their families. So we quite often try to develop skills and build capacity with our professionals and families so that they feel more equipped to support their children with additional support needs and health and wellbeing concerns as well. The other side of our role is looking at development work at both local authority level, school level, national level as well, linking with the government and some of our other professional bodies such as the BPS and the Scottish Division of Educational Psychology and how we feed into that. So a lot of our work to build that capacity is done through our development work. So within Renfrewshire, we have a really strong nurturing relationships approach, which looks at the idea of nurturing children and young people as they grow up and develop. And through that, we bring in partner agencies, families as well to support with that. We're also looking a lot, and something that I lead on is looking to support our young people with speech, language and communication difficulties such as autism into how we can change the school environment and the nursery environment to better suit their needs. So a lot of our work is about changing the environment around the child and not changing the child themselves, because that's not possible, and we would never want to do that because they are who they are. So a lot of our work is designed to support practitioners and families to kind of look at that more social model of disability as well and help them to understand where we're coming from with that. So yeah, those 2 kind of main strands of our work feed into that.
So it sounds very wide-ranging. So operational stuff as well as strategic stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So no 2 days are ever the same. Our diaries are constantly changing, so always have to check what we're going into the next day, because it's never, you're sometimes in the office, sometimes out in schools, sometimes at kind of more leadership meetings, so always changing and different.
Thanks, Katrina. And yourself, Nick?
Yeah, sure. So my job title is a data science product owner at Lloyds Banking Group. And effectively, the product owner role sort of come out of what's called agile methodologies, and it's effectively a sort of a change framework which has been developed over many years to try and help organizations develop sort of user-centric products. So the way we sort of use our Twitter applications, or think about any mobile phone sort of application that you sort of use, there's probably an entire team around there which thinks through what is it that the customer may want from that sort of application interface. And so as a product owner, the key roles are very much around taking that sort of customer-centric lens and thinking about, well, as a customer, what sort of feature would I want to drive? So from a banking perspective, is it something about the way we sort of develop that onboarding journey? I'm sure some of us have lots of some of the new banks like Starling or Monzo, the way they sort of changed that sort of onboarding experience. What sorts of key requirements do I need to think through? Do I need to think through, not just from a sort of a customer lens, but also in terms of what does that mean as a delivery team? So I have a number of people who I work alongside, and effectively it's my role to try and work through what requirements do I have from a customer-centric angle, and how can they be broken down into manageable chunks of work. So for example, it could be building out a database which sort of stores details about certain accounts, or it could be something much further down the line. So for example, reporting. How do you manage the sort of lots of senior people will be interested in what does the uptick in accounts look like? So what does that reporting look like? So there's a number of different sorts of facets to the role, but a lot of it comes down to sort of working backwards from backwards or forwards, depending on which way you look at it, but working forward towards getting that, whatever the feature is that you need to develop, into a sort of a production environment which ultimately engages customers.
Thanks, Nick. Over to you, Maxine.
Okay, hi Katrina, hi Nick. It's been really interesting just hearing about your day-to-day job in itself. But my question is focused more on your first job out of graduation as a student, and how that maybe provided a platform for what you're doing now. And I'd like to ask Nick this one first, and then I'll go to Katrina. So Nick, would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I finished my undergrad at Glasgow, I was really, really keen, or very sure of myself, that I wanted to be an academic. So I spent most of my summers working in Frank Pollock's lab. I think, yeah, Frank's still around at Glasgow, so I was a few times in London. But I really enjoyed working in his labs, and I knew research would be something that would keep me engaged. And at least back then, it was quite exciting applying for funding. So throughout that journey, after finishing at Glasgow, I managed to secure funding to do a PhD. And so I spent about 3 to 4 years between sort of two different universities. Actually, the funding was in Cambridge, but then I spent a bit of time in Liverpool, because basically the study was a longitudinal study. We were following families between populations in Cambridge and Glasgow, and it was a really interesting piece of work to try and work out what sorts of factors, so for example, family factors, socioeconomic conditions, what predicts school success and school transitions after age 11. So that was the sort of research question. So it was a lot of cognitive tasks, like administering cognitive assessments, but also all the work that we have to do as psychologists to do statistics, the modelling behind it. And that was really interesting. But by the end of my PhD, I was not certain or I wasn't convinced that I enjoyed the full funding cycles. There was a lot of emphasis, at least when I was doing my PhD, to consistently go after funding, which definitely was something which started to cause more stress. So I switched. After finishing my PhD, I did a couple of months as a research assistant, and then realised actually I probably need to do something different. So I went actually across into the NHS as an assistant clinical psychologist, with the view being that actually I've spent so much time working with families in social care settings, but actually that was really interesting. And that's kind of how I ended up. That first role was very much in a personality disorder clinic in Highgate in London. And really challenging set of service users that we'd be working with, but really rewarding in as much as it, for anyone who's interested in clinical psychology, I think working with that kind of service group, or it doesn't have to be that service group specifically, but that gives you a really good sense of what you're getting into as an assistant psychologist. And I'm conscious there might be people on this call. Those sorts of roles are also quite challenging, and I'm sure it's just as competitive as it was when I got onto one of those roles. But yeah, I spent 2 years doing that, and it was a really rewarding experience. And in some ways, I think in my description, I sort of called it a squiggly career. We'll come on to that. But yeah, things have changed again since my time in the NHS. So, but yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. And it's just really interesting, and it's one of the things that we tell our students in the professional skills courses, that it's never linear, A to B in terms of careers, that there are people get to where they are for lots of different routes and quite unique. So that's really interesting to hear from you, what you've done prior. Katrina, would you like to tell us what you were doing when you came out of university when you graduated?
Yeah, of course. My route has been a bit more linear, I suppose. So within educational psychology, it's incredibly difficult to come across assistant psychologist positions. They don't tend to really exist in local authorities in the same way as they do for clinical psychology. So quite quickly kind of discounted that route as one of the possibilities, perhaps, knowing that education was where I wanted to end up in educational psychology. So for the first year after graduating, did what I felt like was quite typical of volunteering an awful lot and keeping on my supermarket job in the background. So not as glamorous, not getting away from things, but building up some experience, at least working within schools, particularly primary schools, and using some connections that I had to get into a secondary school as well. And I think if you have those connections, they're so helpful to use because they can quite often get you opportunities that you wouldn't get elsewhere through applying for jobs. After that year of volunteering, I did finally manage to secure a job within a school, so worked as an additional support needs assistant for 2 years it was before getting onto the educational psychology course. But yeah, that job really gave me the opportunity to build up experience within education, working with children and young people. It was in a secondary school, so a lot of kind of building awareness around the issues that they were facing and the things that were barriers to their learning and their well-being as they were growing up and developing. And through that, managed to link with the school's educational psychologist to get some support for applying for the course and interviews and things like that. So again, just using the opportunities as they came up were so valuable. And I had in fact linked with the career service as well as an alumni around that point of kind of just not quite sure where to go next, feeling a little bit stuck. And things did work out, but they were so helpful to kind of think about different routes that I could have possibly taken had it not been for the educational psychology course.
Thank you both. There's sort of a strong encouragement in UK universities for students to sort of complement their studies with things like volunteering, part-time jobs, extracurricular. And I just wondered what sort of things you did. I mean, you've touched on it, Katrina, but maybe were you in any professional associations? Did you go to any of the events? Did you were any student clubs? I just want to encourage students to do that sort of thing and see the value of it. And I just wondered if either yourself, Katrina, or Nick did any of these things, and can you see on reflection the value of them? Shall I start with Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I have to say, like, because I was so interested in the research side of things, a lot of the sorts of volunteering aspects that I contributed to is very much around sort of working around the labs. It's often not the case that you'll necessarily get the sort of summer funding schemes that were available back when I was studying, but equally, I think in this sort of job market, I think it's those sorts of experiences that have really given me sort of the know-how, how to really play with data. I'm sure people on the school, you're probably learning R or SPSS, whichever one that you're doing statistics modules in. But like, there is a difference between sort of playing around with sort of curated data sets versus something in a sort of a lab environment, which is often needs quite a lot of cleansing and things like that. So a lot of the experience I gained was from that. But also alongside that, I did have a job in the university library actually as an IT help desk assistant. So I don't know the sort of general steer towards IT is how I've sort of got into the data science role on reflection, but it's definitely given me enough sort of skills in terms of thinking through sort of user requirements, and particularly that, at least in the university library service, we had so many people coming in with lots of different sorts of requests in terms of what they wanted help with, and whether it was, you know, a sort of a hardware problem or something more software related. So but being in that sort of frontline service type setting, I think definitely gives you the skills to sort of be quite resilient in terms of the sorts of requests that might come at you. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Katrina?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned before, so I'm as a professional civilian with the BPS, and they're our kind of one of our main bodies. So I was a student member with them and found that really helpful in terms of accessing current research, current kind of topics that were coming out. Really enjoyed kind of linking that to the learning we were doing at university that can sometimes seem a little bit distant and you're not quite sure how it relates to a profession or a line of work perhaps. So I found that really, really helpful through the journals and the magazines to get some of that information, and keeping that on after graduating as well to kind of keep that link with the profession. Where you can kind of start to lose that access to the research and what's going on. So that was really helpful for me. I was also on a couple of the society committees. So I was on the Psychology Society committee for the last couple of years of my studies, and the Choral Society as well. So I think, as well as them being lots of fun and making lots of friends, just help with kind of general skills for work around organisation, problem solving, linking with others, all those kind of things that actually are real benefits to when you start to come out and apply for jobs and apply for experience, to show that you are kind of doing some things in the background while you were studying as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to show the 360-degree personality they have. That is, we're more than our degrees or further education. Now, the question I'm going to ask, I think, is just a repetition of the one we've discussed, and I just wondered if it was possible for you to tell me, or have you got any top tips on how students might find jobs in the area? I mean, any websites, any agencies? How might students find jobs within the psychology arena? I know it's a tricky question, but has anyone can offer any wisdoms? Katrina?
So for local council jobs, My Job Scotland is the go-to. That's where they would all be advertised. Assistant psychology jobs do come up every so often. They are quite often research-based, so it gives you a really nice kind of basis for looking at real-world research as well. So looking at the skills that you learn at university and then translating that into how we perhaps do research within education that's not quite as statistics based all the time, but can really bring up some of the kind of factors that can impact on implementation and how you roll out new programs or supports within education, and looking at that. So quite often assistant psychologist jobs within education will focus on that side of our role in terms of supporting our research and development with things. So they do come up. It's worth keeping an eye out for them, and they are quite often research based, and that's where to kind of put your skills.
Cool. I mean, I'm always telling students that maybe you can set alerts for jobs rather than constantly having to be on the site with a few specific filters and what have you. Nick, do you know? I know you're not in psychology now, but do you know any ways in which students might be able to get jobs? Have you got any top tips?
Yeah, a bit like you say, like setting alerts, whether it's on LinkedIn or there are so many websites these days. But I mean, the one which I've certainly found most helpful is LinkedIn, as well as Glassdoor. Actually, both of those platforms are quite tailored, and you can set whatever sorts of descriptions that you want. But I think, particularly when you're thinking about sort of early career roles in sort of trying to sort of bring to life some of the skills that you learn in a psychology program, I think the key thing to try and sort of highlight is the fact that, contrary to what employers might think, or not, this isn't a broad generalization, but I think psychology as a field, it sometimes doesn't necessarily come across as instantly as perhaps something like computing science, about how much emphasis there is on statistics and modeling. And so this sort of growth that we've seen in data science, I think psychology is such a good skill to sell. So if you're looking for jobs like customer relationship analyst, something of that description, or almost any type of analyst role, really. If you can sort of bring that to life, knowing what you know about ANOVAs, t-tests, a lot of these techniques are basically the bread and butter of what a lot of analyst jobs involve. And whether that's not necessarily restricted to financial services, even in the NHS, other public sectors, these sorts of analyst roles are, there's loads of them, and there's no reason why I think psychologists shouldn't be applying to those sorts of roles. They typically seem to attract people from computing science backgrounds and other sorts of degrees, which perhaps I don't know, maybe it's the concepts of database perhaps, but I can assure you it's nothing to be too worried about. A database is effectively a fancy Excel sheet, so if you can manage that, I'm fairly confident that sort of role will fit for a psychology career. Interest.
Thank you. Maxine, I'll let you ask the last question, and then we can go over to the student Q&As, which are at a healthy 7 now. So we can leave some time for that. So over to you, Maxine.
Okay, thanks. Just to say thanks, Katrina, Nick, for your answers to those questions. And I think just pulling out of that before moving on to the next one is the importance of research skills and applying those in different areas in the real world. So, and sometimes I think students don't realise at the time that actually this is really super useful, what I'm doing here in terms of analysing questionnaire data or doing interviews or whatever it is. And we've kind of developed our research methods programme quite a bit, Nick, since you were here, and we're using our studio now, and there's a real emphasis on data skills, and we've actually found some of our more recent graduates have gone into data science and used those skills. So it's definitely becoming a bit more of an unknown path, if you like, than it was maybe 10 years ago. So that's really encouraging. Okay, so my question was, I think we'll start with maybe Katrina. I'll ask you first, and then I'll ask you, Nick. Where do you think educational psychology is going in the next 2 or 3 decades? So, as a profession, and you think there's an area that maybe students should keep an eye on, that one that's maybe going to develop in the next few years?
Yeah, we always say that as a profession, it feels like every 20 years we seem to come back to the same questions. But I think that quite often reflects how we work with society, and we are working in a very big system within education that's obviously impacted by so many different factors, so many different attitudes and values, and that while we see progress with it, it feels like sometimes when you come across a book from kind of 20, 30 years ago, some of the questions they're looking at are the same ones that we're still kind of battling with. And I know that can quite often feel like psychology as a whole, you're kind of still battling with some of the same fundamental issues sometimes. For us at the moment, the kind of topic of inclusion and how you include people with additional support needs and differences within education and within society is kind of a really big topic at the moment. And to be honest, we don't see that going anywhere, because that is quite often the kind of fundamental aspect of our work and how we work with others to help them to understand the benefits of inclusion and how important it is for children and young people as they grow up and develop and move into adulthood, and how all the other services that we then work with and that they'll come into contact with also need to kind of move with that and kind of share some of our values with that as well. So we feel like that is kind of something that's really coming to the forefront. Teachers are becoming much more aware of it. The General Teaching Council for Scotland and teacher training courses are now talking about it a lot more, and there is more training included within it, but there's still a lot of work to do. So we feel that we are making progress with it, but it will still absolutely be a topic that's up for discussion, and it's very much swayed by general societal attitudes, we feel. So there's always going to be something that comes up that slightly adapts or changes it. I think for us as well, on that topic of research, it is one of our roles and one of the functions that we work to, but it's the one that is always kind of the last one that we get round to with the demands of the job and the realities of it. So for us, a lot of our work is around looking at how can we do research within a kind of easy, applicable way that still gets us the kind of evidence base that we need for our practice. So of course, all of our practice is evidence-based and evidence-led. Quite often that evidence is coming from elsewhere perhaps. So we're trying to build more and more on the kind of local and Scottish research base that we have for different supports and interventions that we may put in place. So we're trying to kind of change our roles slightly, as we have done over the years, to allow us more time for that research and that development, so that we know that we're bringing the best work that we can to our establishments and our families, to support them with things. So again, I think that's something that over time will continue to progress and move forward, so that we can become a profession that has a real strong evidence base and share practice amongst ourselves.
Thank you so much. That's two really important points I think you've brought up. And also in higher education, we see how the inclusion is a big issue at the moment too. So that's really good to know. And Nick, where do you feel your sector, and I'm saying data science, I know that you do more than that, but where do you think it's going in the next few decades? You think there's an area that students should maybe keep their eyes on?
Yeah, it's there's a couple of things, I guess. The first one, I think, which is possibly, this is a short-term thing, and I think most of the industry, whether you're talking about data science, data engineering, anything really to do with data, one of the key trends that we're seeing, and financial institutions, I guess, are working their way through it as best as, or as fast as they can, simply for cost reasons, or not necessarily simply, but there's lots of other benefits as well. But that big thing is to do with the transition to cloud services. So let me see if I can sum this up without complicating it too much. Effectively, large-scale organizations use on-premise hardware. So think about computers in buildings which run all the applications which we need to. A lot of that is changing, so that you give those you stop worrying about maintaining hardware on your own site, and you give that sort of contract out to the likes of Google, Amazon. There's lots of competitors in that playing field. So, for example, one of the key things on our graduate scheme at Lloyd's for the data scientists, one of the things that we focus on is to make sure they are accredited users of, for example, the Google Cloud platform. I think that, for people who are interested in these sorts of trends, that's a certification you can take quite easily. That there are lots of training programs. If you Google Cloud Associate, you can get a certification. I think that's a very quick win to signaling to an employer, actually, you're interested in this area, and you have at least you have a cursory understanding of what moving to cloud looks like. But then thinking more widely, I guess one of the key things, which I guess we're all getting more and more used to, is fraud. And I guess this is kind of where, from a psychology perspective, I think this is where we're going to see a lot more growth in terms of what sorts of technologies, what sorts of modeling techniques do we use to try and prevent fraud, not for both sort of vulnerable customers, but also the average person who might be fairly competent. The sorts of strategies that have been developed, they're quite complex. We've probably all read in the articles how certain individuals have been scammed out of thousands of pounds of money due to some sort of WhatsApp message or whatever. And when you think about sort of all the work you might have read on executive functions, that sort of hot and cool thinking, how can we use those sorts of frameworks to develop models which can help us make better choices effectively? Because ultimately, a lot of these things, what we're really talking about is trying to influence customer behavior, which protects customers, but also businesses. And I guess that's one of the other trends which we're going to see. What sorts of technologies and modeling techniques are we going to be able to use to try and help customers from financial fraud and other sorts of fraud, not just financial, obviously. But yeah, I think the move to cloud certainly feels something which is definitely around the corner for most organisations, and but sort of protecting customers in whatever way we can, I think, will be the other key thing, which is probably an emerging trend.
Thanks so much, Nick, and that is really useful to know and think about for the future. Are we going now to the student questions?
That's right. Yes. Yes. Thank you. We've got a few questions here. Some of them I think we can ask. Some of them I think have been answered already. But the first one, Nick, if you could keep it a short-ish answer. Louise asks, what were the best and worst parts of your assistant clinical psychologist experience, and what made you want to leave?
What were the best parts? So the best parts was learning so much about different counselling methods. So I really enjoyed learning about schema therapy, dialectical behavioural therapy. Those are really sort of intense models of delivery, whether in group settings or individual, as well as or supervised one-to-one sessions. It was really challenging to get my head around the frameworks, but really interesting because I think particularly something like schema therapy, it's such a, I don't know, it feels so relatable and something which quite often you can talk about with clients quite quickly and try and help them understand their difficulties in quite just a different way, I guess, to the way some of us may, if you know enough about cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy, I think schema therapy is definitely something I like to highlight. What else? And I guess the other side of this, perhaps what made me want to leave was, to some degree, where the NHS is at the moment. I certainly got to a point in that role where I couldn't see exactly how I was helping. I think it took, after 2.5 years, when you start seeing service users coming back, re-referred, I know you're not meant to take it as a personal sign of failure and all of that, but it was really difficult to see how I'm impacting change. And I think it's towards that time where I actually started engaging a lot more in service improvement, that sort of activity, which is kind of how I sort of made sense of the role, that actually the client-facing work is very challenging. It is very draining. I can't highlight how much that will tire you out. But in terms of things that motivate me, I think I was really looking for something where I can see impact, where I know that I'm contributing to something which is going forward. I certainly found that through sort of service user involvement activity and sort of service monitoring type work that I did.
Thank you, Nick. I think the next question of Louise is, she's delighted that you've had a squiggly career, and but she also, I think this is the same answer why you didn't go to do a doctorate in clinical psychology. The same reason?
It's more or less the same thing. I think, yeah, I mean, I can talk, I'm happy to pick up on this afterwards as well, but yeah, I did apply for the clinical doctorate a couple of times. I didn't, even after going through that process, in many ways, I struggled to work out what more experience. And I think there's probably something to be said in terms of there's a lot of, it is a very competitive application. So I don't know if you've seen the numbers on these things. It is extremely competitive. So I think, yeah, the best thing I can say is to look at this sort of line of career as a vocation. I think if you don't look at it as a vocation, if there's any uncertainty, the squiggly career is mainly about that. Definitely try other things. And then when you're sure, actually, this is the thing that works for you, there's nothing stopping you coming back to a clinical career, in my opinion, at least.
Thank you. Someone's asked, I think we mentioned where you can get a job, and we said, except LinkedIn, what's the other one mentioned? I think we didn't have clear connection, but they didn't catch it. Can anyone remember what we mentioned in terms of looking for jobs? Might have been Katrina, your suggestion, your first suggestion.
So My Job Scotland, and I think Nick also mentioned Glassdoor.
My Job Scotland.
Yeah.
My Job Scotland, okay. And Glassdoor, which is a classic student one, and then there's lots on LinkedIn. And also, if you've got an idea of a company you want to go to their careers pages on their website. Yes.
I would just add to that, if there's something you're really strongly passionate about and you happen to find on LinkedIn who the recruiter is, by all means drop them a message. I have done this, and I can't overstate how quickly it can work, because actually that signals to them you've been proactive, you've done your research.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a big promoter of being, making those connections. Can I just say, there's also, it said, would you say being an educational psychologist is more about focus on the children's learning style, special needs and strategies, and a smaller part in relation to mental health needs? Katrina, maybe.
It has changed a lot. I would say I started the educational psychology course in 2014, came out and started working in 2016. I would say at that point the course still focused quite a lot on learning and additional support needs in that kind of traditional sense that we maybe think of within education. I would say over the last kind of 6 years of working, there has been much more of a shift into us supporting mental health and well-being, particularly with the impact of COVID and how unavoidable that impact has been on children, families and teachers' mental health and well-being. It's now quite a significant part of our role, not necessarily directly supporting through intervention, but by trying to find the best ways that we can to support teachers in particular to feel that they're okay, so that they are coming into school every day able to support the children that perhaps aren't so okay, or support the families that are going through tough times. A big thing this year as well coming from our schools is the cost of living crisis and the impact that's having on families. So it really does feel at the moment that well-being as a topic is kind of forefront to everything, because without that in place we can't really get onto things such as learning and developing those skills. So we're kind of taking that step, not backwards necessarily, but looking at, I guess, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that if we don't feel safe and have our basic needs being met, we can't reach the things around learning and accessing the curriculum so much. So there's definitely a balance, and part of our role is sometimes helping schools to unpick what a child's primary need is at that point in time. So whether it's well-being or whether it's learning, part of our assessment is perhaps helping them to explore that a wee bit.
Thank you. This might be a question for you, Nick. Sophie asks, how feasible is it that psychology students can compete with computer science students in tech? How can we improve our chances of a successful switch into data science or data tech?
Great question. I think the key thing, the differentiating factor from my perspective, is actually the sort of training that you go through on your degree. You get a really good understanding in research methods. From a tech perspective, I think the expertise is very much about efficient coding, writing something which looks really good and works as functional code. But I think, if you like, from a psychology perspective, it's about knowing where to explore, how to set up a hypothesis, and how to be able to see that hypothesis through and, draw conclusions. I think those sorts of skills are the differentiator. And I think what I should have also mentioned, actually, one of the other questions was, I talked about analyst jobs. You'll also see sort of roles which advertise themselves as behavioral economists. I think it's really important to sort of challenge behavioral economists are very similar in as much as we're using the same sorts of techniques, the same sort of hypothesis-driven frameworks to understand behavior. So I hope that helps.
That's a good answer. Thank you. Louise asks, as part of your job, are you involved in recruitment of people? And what advice, I mean, we have given some advice already, would you give to students who are seeking jobs? What do you, when you're recruiting people, you're interviewing people, what do you look for? Is there anything that you particularly makes them stand out as an ideal candidate? Katrina?
So I suppose our job's a wee bit different, that we would only be recruiting educational psychologists who've been through the course, but a lot of it really is about the skills that person is bringing to the team. So it's not always about all the knowledge that you hold, but it's a lot about who you are as a person, I think, for our job. We work with people day in, day out. We're constantly building relationships with schools, with families. It's often quite quick and quite rapid. So a lot of the core skills around active listening, being approachable, being open, being a good communicator are really, really important for our job, as well as a kind of sound understanding of a lot of the core theory around it. I would say a lot of it is around people skills, really, and being able to use the psychology to understand people and to understand why things maybe are a bit stuck and how we can help to problem solve there.
Thank you. And Nick, we've got a very short amount of time. I just wondered, if you interview people, what are the things that make people stand out for you?
I think more or less everything. Yeah, Katrina said there's a lot of similarities. The key difference when you're working in a corporate environment is it's the internal stakeholders, the internal parts of the business. So you're trying to persuade, you're trying to get them on side with whatever initiative you're driving. So the sorts of the core skills, which are very much to do with emotional intelligence, that kind of thing, those are the key things which we look for. And in other technical roles, we will probably obviously prod for a degree of understanding there. But yeah, I don't think I can overstate how much people skills matter.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, those transferable skills. Someone asks if the recording will be accessible afterwards. Yes, it is. Thank you for that question. It's going to be in a couple of weeks' time on the YouTube channels for the Career Service here at the University of Glasgow. Give us a few weeks to sort it out and edit it because it's a bit busy period in the term. But yes, it will be available on the YouTube channel. I think we're coming towards the end of this now. I just want to thank both Katrina and Nick for their time today. You've been really, really interesting, and I think the students will have got some great takeaways. It is the last panel of the day, so I think you've been a great ending to what's been a really informative day. So thank you very much.